Thank everyone who is joining us today for our webinar with Ed Pinto on fixing housing, separating myth from reality. First of all, I'm Joel Griffith. I'm a senior fellow and policy advisor here at Advancing American Freedom. We are an organization committed to a prosperous America where freedom and opportunity is driven by American values. We like to say that the conservative movement lives here at AAF. So these Freedom Forum webinars that we've been doing are important conversations on tax, trade, economics, and we'll be doing this throughout 2026 as well. Our YouTube channel has all the prior webinars. We've hosted everyone from former Vice President Pence to Phil Kerpen recently at Unleashed Prosperity, but also many other scholars such as Lydia Mashburn from AIER. So before we get started, let me introduce our special guest today. It's Ed Pinto. He is the Senior Fellow and Co-Director of the AEI Housing Sector at the American Enterprise Institute. He has a lot of past experience prior to his work in the think tank world. In fact, he was the credit officer at Fannie Mae. So he has been through a lot. He's one of the nation's leading authorities on federal housing policy. And he's really the premier expert on what went wrong in 2008 and also what's going wrong with today's affordability crisis. So with that, I'm going to ask the first question over to you, Ed. Today's conversation is entitled Fixing Housing, Separating Myth from Market Reality. Housing affordability today is near all-time lows. Home prices adjusted for inflation are right at all-time highs. And if you look at home prices, even median household income, it's about the worst it's ever been. So how would you describe the state of the housing market today?
Thank you, Joel, and thank you for the opportunity to participate. Let me just say, I was at Fannie Mae as the Executive Vice President, Chief Credit Officer back in the 1980s, before they went over to the dark side. So I was not involved in all of the excesses that they and Freddie Mac and FHA were involved in the lead up to the great financial crisis. But I was, given my past experience in housing finance, going back to my first job in the 1970s, I was able to figure out what went wrong and write quite a bit about that. So you're right, we've gotten to a point where housing is very unaffordable. Let's start with a myth right off the top. Builders don't build big houses because they want to. They build big houses because that's the only thing that's legal to be built on the lots that cities and counties will allow them to build on in states. In many places, there are minimum lot sizes. In many places, there's the land is zoned for 1 acre, half acre, quarter acre. And given the price of land today, the price of a house is driven largely by the price of the land. And builders would build on smaller lots if they had the ability to do it, but they don't. And so that's one of the reasons that house prices have outstripped the ability of people to pay. That's mostly, it's not so much construction costs having gone up, but the land share of that house has gone up tremendously, particularly existing areas, California. In California, it's not uncommon to have the land be 60, 70, 80, 90% of the value of the property, the house and the land. What normal is something like 20%. And so if you drive up the price of land by making it scarce, which is what local governments and state governments do, you're going to drive up the price of houses. Builders, of course, they're out to make money. They're practicing the free market, and they look at a piece of land and they go, well, can I make more money building, let's say you have 10 acres, just have 1 acre lots. Can I make more money building $1 million houses on 1 acre lots? That's $10 million. Or can I make more money building 40 houses that are $500,000 each? Well, as Henry Ford figured out, you make a lot more money building for the masses than you do building for the highest end. And if you then translate that to the next step down, which are townhomes, can I make more money building on those 10 acres building 200 townhomes at 2,000 square feet per lot than I can building $10 million houses. Well, obviously, if you build 200 townhomes at, say, $350,000, that's multiples and multiples of the 10 million. And again, as Henry Ford demonstrated, you make a lot more money building for the masses. And that's what the system we have in place. We have 33,000 zoning jurisdictions in the United States, each one of which is saying, don't build here. And so when you have 33,000 jurisdictions, almost all of them saying, don't build here, and you have 50 states that have given up the ability, they still have it, but have basically delegated that authority to their municipalities and counties, you end up with the lowest common denominator in charge, which is the smallest unit of government. And that unit of government says, we don't want any more housing.
Yeah, just as an anecdote on that, I currently live in a suburb in South Florida much of the year with intense zoning restrictions. If you want to have an additional child, you're going to be fighting your zoning board, and these homes, middle class homes, are going for close to $1 million. Back where I'm from in Beaver Creek, Ohio, you can actually still buy a home right out of college for about 300, but that's because there are so few zoning restrictions. So yes, thanks for pointing out some of the ways in which local governments can make affordable housing onerous, if not unobtainable. But with that, I'd like to transition over to the federal side. A lot of our listeners, they work in public policy, or they're concerned with the ways in which federal government policy are impacting home prices. Of course, there's only so much you can do to avoid the poor local policies. You can move cross country, but you can never fully escape the reach of the federal government and federal policy. So could you outline some of the ways in which federal policy has been contributing to the lack of affordability?
Well, let's start with the granddaddy of them all. The federal government created this patchwork of 33,000 communities back in 1922. People, well, how did that happen? Well, Herbert Hoover, who was somewhat of a Woodrow Wilson type progressive, who believed that engineers and planners could figure out anything, don't leave it up to markets, basically said, oh, we need zoning, and we need exclusionary zoning, meaning we need zoning that limited subdivisions or limited use to single family detached homes, which by definition meant larger lots and larger homes, which their purpose was to drive up prices. Why they want to drive up prices, it sounds crazy today, but of course they had a nefarious reason, and that was to keep minorities and ethnic minorities out of the Roaring '20s development that was happening in the 1920s. And they succeeded beyond their wildest expectation. They didn't use it through the force of federal statute. They just came out with a model zoning ordinance, which then was blessed by the Supreme Court in 1926. And that zoning or model zoning ordinance or statute set up the states being under the 10th Amendment of our Constitution, having the power to do zoning. And then it recommended that the states delegate that power to their constituent municipalities at the county and city level. And that really started in 1922, and we're still living with that. Before that, it was perfectly normal to have a single family detached home next to a duplex, next to some townhomes, next to a small apartment building, next to a grocery store. And if you think of the places around the country that are most attractive to people, they're precisely those areas. Think of Georgetown, DC. Think of Alexandria, Virginia. Think of places in San Francisco. These are places that had a variety of housing, and people liked that. But the planners said, no, no, you don't want that. We need to make it so that you only had this here and nothing else that intruded on it. And the goal was to raise prices. So the federal government is the beginning of this. The second problem is the federal government is not very good at adding supply. In the 100+ years it's been involved in this, it's undertaken some programs to add supply on a few occasions. One was in the 1950s, that kind of crashed and burned. Another one was in 1968, that crashed and burned. And another one you've already referenced was in the 1990s, which led to the great financial crisis. So the federal government's efforts at trying to goose supply, A, are difficult, and B, when they've tried it, they've crashed and burned. What the federal government is excellent at is goosing demand.
Hmm.
And we see that. Think of the three areas of the economy that grow the fastest. Higher education, backed by student loans from the federal government, healthcare, backed by Obamacare, topic well in the news today, and B and C, housing, backed by the alphabet soup of Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, FHA, VA, rural housing, Ginnie Mae, 11 federal home banks, and the list goes on and on. And so the federal government's very good at goosing demand, and the Fed is excellent at goosing demand. That's what happened during the pandemic. Is the Fed decides to drive interest rates down, mortgage rates down to below 3%. They do that through quantitative easing and zero interest rate policies. Then house prices go up about 41% from 2019 to 2024. But incomes only go up 11%. And of course, that's the inflation in house prices that we're living with today that's been a big contributor to making housing unaffordable. So the federal government is really good at goosing demand, but it has very limited power under our constitutional structure, because of the 10th Amendment, which says all powers not given to the federal government, and land use is not a power given to the federal government, reside with the states. The other issue that involves both the state and local and federal government are the right to property, because the zoning has become a constraint on property ownership. And so this is something your viewers should be very interested in, because we have, under our constitutional structure and under state constitutions, property is supposed to be sacrosanct. It's supposed to be one of a fundamental right, and you're supposed to have the right to use that property. And so we've gotten to a situation where you can do virtually nothing with your property today, a single family house, without the permission of multi levels of government, number one. And number two, if you want to do something as minor as build an accessory dwelling unit in your backyard, that is illegal in virtually the entire, 50 states around the country. There are some states that have made it legal, but it's generally illegal to do something as innocuous as building an accessory dwelling unit, even though we're supposed to be a country that values property rights.
Yeah. Well, thanks. And you mentioned Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac in passing in relation to the GSEs and how the federal government is goosing demand. Could you dive into a bit about Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, how that mortgage operation actually works? And there's a lot of talk right now in DC about potentially ending the federal conservatorship of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Of course, they went into conservatorship after they nearly went bankrupt, going on almost 20 years ago now. What would real privatization look like? What should it look like? And how exactly have Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac contributed to this home price inflation since the last housing bubble nearly 20 years ago?
So myself, along with some colleagues, have put out a number of papers back in 2011, 2013, 2018, 19, for the exact year. And we basically said the same thing in each case. You basically need to shrink Fannie and Freddie, and that can be done relatively straightforwardly. Number one, get them out of areas that have nothing to do with promoting home ownership. So they do multifamily. I used to be in charge of multifamily before I was chief credit officer. I was in charge of single family and multifamily, and they really add nothing to the multifamily process. They don't make anything more affordable, and so they could just get out of that business entirely. So let's focus on the main part of the business, which is single family. They shouldn't be doing refinances. Refinances have nothing to do with home ownership. They shouldn't have anything to do with financing small, 1, 2, 3, 4 unit rentals. That has nothing to do with home ownership. They shouldn't be financing second homes. That has nothing to do with primary home ownership. And so they should be getting out of areas of the business that really have nothing to do with this core function that the federal government might at least arguably, be interested in. Next, their loan limits, because they're set under a formula, I won't go into how it's set, but the numbers just keep going up and up and up and up. So now their Fannie and Freddie's basic limit is 800 and something $1,000, even though the median priced home in the United States is something like $375,000. And then, of course, they have high cost area limits that are well over $1 million. Well, you can imagine that if you have these entities, Fannie, Freddie, and then competing with FHA, that with these very high loan limits and very expansive business model that keeps expanding, that's not, and they have no ability to add to supply. They do nothing to add to supply. I challenge anyone to explain how they've ever added one housing unit to supply. So what they do is they basically provide financing, and we call that the leverage punch bowl. And the leverage punch bowl is they just add all this leverage. FHA adds a lot more. They are the subprime lender in the country today. The government is basically the exclusive subprime lender after the great financial crisis. Fannie and Freddie compete with FHA for the better part of the FHA business, which is the worst part of the Fannie Freddie business. And it's all that competition and all of the leverage that they provide in the form of smaller down payments, in this form of higher debt ratios that allow people to chase the prices. Because again, they're not doing anything to add supply. And then you have these 33,000 local communities, zoning jurisdictions that say, we don't need any more housing. And they're constraining the supply. And the federal government is working mightily to promote demand. And so Fannie and Freddie are pushing up against a boulder uphill that they can't possibly succeed at. How do we know? Well, the homeownership rate has barely budged since the early 1960s, late 1960s. Freddie Mac was formed in 1971. Fannie Mae was authorized to buy conventional loans in, I think, 1968. Since they've been around, the housing affordability has gotten worse, not better. If they were doing something better, you would see a better outcome. We haven't seen a better outcome. And people then say, well, how bad would it be without them? Well, in my opinion, we'd actually be a lot better off without them.
Yeah, and each one of those instances in which you've mentioned, in which the footprint has grown so large, whether it's the cash out refis or second homes or higher caps, this is the federal government deciding that this is the chosen area of asset accumulation. And so the resources are funneled into this. And of course, we all need a home. That demand is not going to change. What has changed is the amount of capital that's become available to that, because the federal government has decided that this is where they believe more capital should be allocated. Am I correct in that?
Well, let me just, it's a little more nuanced than that. As I mentioned earlier, when you have a home, it actually is comprised of two capital components: the land and the structure. The structure actually depreciates in general. It's a depreciating asset. It's not depreciating as fast as an automobile depreciates, but it does depreciate. It requires constant maintenance. Land, on the other hand, doesn't require that much maintenance. It's a capital asset, and because of the actions of these 33,000 zoning jurisdictions, they make land scarce. They make it expensive. They make it difficult to build. And therefore, the amount of capital in this package called residential single-family housing that's combined of these two components, the land and the structure, more and more gets pushed into the land component. And the zoning restrictions then say you're not allowed to use that capital land to its highest and best use. And we see that in the case of what we call McMansions. So you're in an area, Florida is one that this happens frequently. Any place with expensive homes, California, Bethesda, Maryland, etc., this all happens. You have a home. It may be 50 or 60 years old. The land now is 80% of the value. The structure is worth relatively little. Again, it's a depreciating asset. Again, we're assuming it's been kept up, but it's still relative to the land, only 20%, that then becomes a tear down. Under the zoning regime that the federal government put in place 100 years ago, the owner of that property, who becomes potentially a developer, says, wait a minute, it's not efficient to use this capital. Let's assume they buy it for $1 million, just to have a nice round number. I've got 800,000 land. I have $20,000 in this structure. That is not an efficient use of $800,000 of land capital. I'm going to tear down the $200,000 structure. What can I build in its place? Well, if you have the normal zoning regime in place, you can build another single family house. So you then choose to build a McMansion. I'm going to replace that 1,500 square foot house with a 4,500 square foot house, because it isn't economic to build another 1,500 square foot house on that $800,000 piece of property, land. And so I'm now going to build a 4,500 square foot home. That home isn't going to be valued at $200,000 structure. It's going to be valued at $2.5 million. And so now I have the $1 million in land, which I've cleared the structure. It's still worth roughly the $1 million because it was a tear down. And I've added that to the $2.5 million. I now have $3.5 million, and I've reduced the capital that's going into land from 80% down to 30-something%. I'm making a more efficient use of capital. So you're right about the pushing about capital, but it ends up revolving around what happens with the land. Now think of the alternative, where, and this happens in Houston, it's happened in Austin, parts of Seattle and Palisades Park, New Jersey, and many other places, but not enough of them, where you can build 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 5 or 6 homes on, say, a 10,000 square foot lot. So instead of 10,000 square feet, you could build 1,666 square foot, which is about the size of a townhome lot. Now, all of a sudden, you still have that same $1 million worth of land, but you're now going to build 6 townhomes and sell them for, I don't know, $800,000 a piece. But now the land component is only $180,000. And you've now added $600,000 in structure. So now you've taken your land cost down to 25%. And so your capital that's being used for land for that home is much less intense. At the same time, you now have 6 homes that are selling for whatever that math adds up to be, $800,000. You now have $4.8 million of value, including the land, as compared to the $3.5 million example with the McMansion. So if you're a builder, which would you pick? Well, you'd pick the one where you could build 6. Well, we've done 35 case studies around the country, and in every case where the builders had a choice of what they would build, and we have cases where on this side of the street, it was legal to build the 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 on the lot, and on the other side of the street, it wasn't. And that's all due to the zoning. The same builders, on one side of the street, they build the 6, on the other side of the street, they build the 1. It has nothing to do with the land, the builder's choice. It's entirely dictated by these 33,000 local jurisdictions.
Yeah. Thanks for that great summary, Ed, on some of the leading drivers of this housing price inflation. I wanted to turn over to a few of these solutions that have been proposed. And as ironically or amusingly, these solutions have nothing to do with the primary drivers that you've just mentioned.
No surprise.
We've heard a lot over the last few months about the possibility of offering a new 50-year mortgage rather than the standard 30-year mortgage to be provided through lenders that sell their loans to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. What are your thoughts on that proposal to provide a 50-year mortgage amortization that would be considered a conforming loan option?
It's a terrible idea. The federal government has tried 40-year mortgages back in 1968. I already talked about how that crashed and burned. It tried 40-year loans and interest-only loans, which are 50-year amortizations, not far from that, in the run-up to the great financial crisis by Fannie and Freddie. Basically, as I said, the government is very good at promoting demand. It's very bad at adding supply. So you have to evaluate any of these ideas by asking 2 questions. A, going to a 50-year mortgage, will it promote demand? Well, yes. You now can buy more house with the same amount of income because your monthly payment is going to be less. Why is your monthly payment less? Because a 50-year amortization has a lower amortization component than the 30-year amortization. So you get to buy, your income goes further with the same 50-year mortgage versus the 30. But it adds not one unit of housing. So if you goose demand and don't do anything for supply, what does Economics 101 tell us? Prices have to go up. Uh, so that's why what's the next one that's being proposed, Joel?
Well, the next one has been this notion of perhaps of allowing investors to provide a second mortgage for a conforming loan and allow the investors to share in the home price appreciation. And I'd like your thoughts on that because there's two ways to go about that. One would be simply allow the private sector to provide those alternatives. The other notion is to allow those types of secondary mortgages to be considered sufficient for conforming loan purposes. And somebody could take on that second mortgage instead of paying interest. You go ahead and you'll share in the price appreciation with the lender.
So actually, the ones I've heard haven't used second mortgages so much. They just take an equity interest. So they pay you 20% of the value of the house for a X% equity interest in that. And so then when the house value goes up, they share in that. When the house value goes down, they share in that. But they give you this 20% up front, which you can, in theory, use for a down payment or whatever. So you have to ask yourself the same question. If you do this with a 30-year mortgage, which is the standard mortgage today, the natural inclination is going to be, I wanted to buy a house. I'm going to try to keep the numbers simple for $400,000. And they're going to give me 20% up front. Forget what share they get. That's irrelevant for this discussion. So they're going to give me $80,000 and take some of the equity interest. And now I have $80,000 in my pocket. Well, just like the 50-year mortgage, if you're a buyer and there's scarce supply and no more supply got added, you're going to say, I can use that $80,000 to, it's going to reduce my monthly payment on the $400,000 house, but now I could buy a $500,000 house and use that money to reduce the payment and in effect buy a more expensive house. But what ultimately is going to happen is the $400,000 house, if this gets common, and we've seen this in our studies, if this gets commonplace, then everyone starts bidding up against each other, and all you get is a increase in home prices. The chairman of the Federal Reserve, Mariner Eccles, and the Federal Reserve building is named after him, the Eccles building. He had a great quote back in 1947. If expanded credit calls forth more production, it's desirable. But if it only permits one borrower to bid up against another would-be borrower for scarce goods and thus adds to upward pressure on prices, it's dangerous. And that, in a nutshell, in 1947, says what the federal government's been doing for decades. And so we actually, 8 or 9 years ago, met with a company that was proposing exactly what you said, but doing it through this equity sharing. And we said, fine, if you then say, instead of using the money to create more demand, you use it to reduce the amortization loan term, the exact opposite of 50-year loan, go from 30 to 20. So now the consumer, no matter what happens, if house prices go up, yes, they've given away part of their equity, but because they use that equity to speed up the amortization, they end up with more equity in the long run. And if house prices go down, yes, they've given away some of their equity, so they don't have as much downside, but they do have downside, but they're now paying off the mortgage faster, and they ended up coming out ahead there. We calculated this, and virtually under any circumstance, under any scenario other than the most egregious, either upside or downside, they came out ahead by doing it this way. We spent a lot of time with this company, and then when they brought it to market, what did they do? They ended up doing it with 30-year mortgages, and it ended up people buying more expensive houses. So again, it's very difficult given what we call the leverage punch bowl, to introduce new things that don't end up just adding more leverage. So we've basically said, look, there's an expression in real estate: the three most important things in real estate are location, location, location. We've done research that shows that the three most important things in housing affordability is smaller lot, smaller lot, smaller lot. And by that, I mean that if you build on a smaller lot, that's less capital for land, and therefore the price of the house can be lower. We've already talked about builders will naturally do that. Secondly, if you build on a smaller lot, the house itself will be smaller. I'll come back to that in a minute. And then thirdly, if you build single family attached or townhomes, those are on even less land, and even with the same size single family attached, they're simpler to build because they don't have as many exterior walls, they're a simpler footprint, and you get a commensurate lower price. So we did a thought experiment across the entire country. We said, well, how many homes got built from 2000 to 2024 in new residential subdivisions in the United States, single family homes? And it turns out it's about 13 million homes got built. We said, well, for the detached, what was the average number of homes per lot based on lot size? It was 5.4. That's about 8,000 square foot lot, give or take. And then for the townhomes, it was about 23 homes per acre, which is a little under 2,000 square feet per lot. I said, what if, as a thought experiment, you said instead of 5.5 homes per lot, you went to 8. So now we're talking about 5,500 square feet. Still, it's not a tiny lot, but it's a decent sized lot. By the way, that house we estimate would have 1,900 square feet, which is lower than what the houses that got built on median of 2,300 square feet, but it's still not, it's a still 4-bedroom house, and certainly family sized. And the townhomes would be about 1,700 square feet. But the prices of those homes, instead of being at $517,000 for that median house on the 5.4 homes per acre, would drop to 463,000, which is about $50,000 less, around about 10%. And the price of the single family attached to it, would go even lower. And so you actually increase the affordability by doing this. And instead of 12 million homes, and this is the real kicker, instead of 12 million homes over that 25-year time period, you would have gotten 25 million homes on the exact same amount of land, which goes back to your capital intensity. You're going to use capital land more intensely, which then makes housing more affordable.
Wow. Well, and I got to say, I love how you have crystallized so much of the discussion into ways in which state and local federal governments are compressing supply, while at the same time you've got the federal programs juicing demand. I think you did a brilliant job crystallizing that, and we have time for just a few questions. I'm going to combine two into one because I don't want to go over on our time limit. But there have been several proposals and suggestions brought forth on the state level and now by some national politicians that actually do attempt to address the demand problem, but in a different way. We see a lot of state legislators right now wanting to put restrictions on institutional and investor home ownership. They're arguing that that is causing prices to go up. And then we have some that are suggesting that if we can just resolve the illegal immigration problem, that will reduce demand and cause prices to go down. What are your thoughts on those two suggestions?
Well, let's start with the first one, institutional investors. And so let's define an institutional investor. So you have what are called mom and pop investors. So first of all, about what is it? 13%, 15% of all single family homes are owned by investors. Most of that is what are called mom and pop investors. About 14% of that are mom and pop. Institutional investors, which we define as those that own 100 or more properties nationwide, they own less than 1% of all the single family rentals in the country. So first of all, this is not a big issue. Even in the place where they have the most, which is around the Atlanta area, it's just a relatively few percent. And so it's an easy group to basically complain about because it takes away the need to actually address the real issues, which is the constraints on land use and driving up prices. And so we basically don't think that this is a huge market, and you've got a very small percentage, less than 1% nationwide, that's owned. And what most people don't think about is there's constantly in and out of their portfolio. They're buying, they're selling, they're buying, they're selling, but the level of their portfolio stays pretty constant. It has at least since the mid-aught years. And so we don't think that's a big issue. And we've put out a playbook. If you Google the AEI playbooks, you'll get a link to 6,600 playbooks. And we've got a page in there just on this. And I'm looking, I was reading the national numbers, but we do it for metropolitan areas in each state. And so all that data is freely available in the playbooks. Your second question about immigration. Well, I know HUD just came out with something very recently on this, last few months. We took sort of two looks at this. One was we looked at the immigration that occurred during 2023 to 2024. I think it was the last half of 23, first half of 24. So if you recall, that was the period of the most open of open borders. And so whatever immigration was going on was largely illegal. And so while the data source, which is the Census Bureau, didn't distinguish between legal and illegal, we basically assumed the vast majority of what was happening while the borders were wide open during that 12-month period was illegal immigration. We then looked at metro by metro, the correlation between house prices at a metro level and the immigration level, and rents at the same thing, the immigration level by metro. And we found a slightly negative correlation. It was very small, but we didn't find any real correlation that said, oh, the more immigration there was, led to higher rents or higher home prices. That didn't surprise us particularly because we knew that the Fed back in 2020, 2021, 2022, when they had the wide open spigots on what we call the monetary punch bowl up until mid 22, was really driving house price inflation. It had nothing to do with immigration. And we also knew that a lot of illegal immigrants, in New York, they were being put up in hotels. In other places, they were doubling up with friends and family or whatever. And so we didn't think it was having that much of an impact. We then flash forward to the home prices for 2024 and 2025. As I said, the Fed drove up house prices to where they were going up 18%, I believe, year over year in mid 2000 by mid 2022, and that we've been going down almost in a slope is very constant since that midpoint in 2022. The slope has been very constant. And so we looked at the slope in 2024 and we looked at the slope in 2025. And of course, 2024, we had wide open borders in the first half. In the second half, the borders were closed some by Biden pre-election, but they hadn't done any deportations particularly. And then we have 2025 when the borders were closed and we've had deportations and voluntary repatriations. And we can find no difference nationally in the house price trend. It's been a disinflationary trend for the last few years for the reasons that I've mentioned, but we haven't found any relationship before and after that point. And as economists would expect to see something before and after given the two circumstances, and we haven't seen anything. And so we think that's another indicator. And when we look at where the house prices are going down the most, which largely is Florida and some other parts of the South and Southwest, those are trends that have been going on since the peak was reached in 2022. Why? Because those are the areas that have been pushed up the most by the Fed when due to their zero interest and quantitative easing policy that drove rates down to below 3%. So there's now a reversion to the mean, and that reversion to the mean that's occurring, again, we can find no relationship at all to levels of deportation or repatriation.
Right. And Ed, we have time for one more question here. We have a number of folks that work with state and local governments. If you were speaking directly to local elected government officials, what key things would you encourage them to do in 2026 on the local level?
So let me answer that with two comments. One is on the local level, it's just get out of the way. Again, we've done 30 case studies across the board. We have found that when you institute by right, meaning not non-discretionary land use policies, particularly zoning and lot size that are non-discretionary, and you get out and you have keep it simple, stupid land use rules that go along with it, you will get an explosion of housing. Again, we've done nearly 30 of these case studies, and in every case, there was an explosion of housing, and it happens pretty quickly. So the first recommendation is figure out how to get out of the way, and it starts with things like smaller lot, smaller lot, smaller lot. Start approving townhomes. Start approving small lot, single family detached. Do things like that. But the second thing I would say is speaking to state officials, because under our constitutional structure, that power, land use power, police power, it's the exercise of the police power, not cops and robbers, but the ability to control land use resides at the state level. It doesn't reside at the federal level, and it's delegated to the localities, those 33,000 localities. The state needs to take some of that discretion back, and it has to start with lot size. And Texas has done that. So Texas is a state led by Houston that is the most affordable large state in the country. It has the lowest homeless rate of any large state in the country. Houston has the lowest housing costs and the lowest homeless rate of any large city in the country. And that's not an accident. It's because Houston's case, they've been promoting smaller lots for 35 years. But Texas, in July of this year, passed Senate Bill 15 that was signed by the governor. It's already taken effect, which says to 18 cities in Texas, you can't set a minimum lot size in excess of 3,000 square feet. That discretion lies with the owner of the property. That's a property right that they have. It doesn't lie with you as the municipality. You're looking at health, safety, and welfare. There is no justification under health, safety, and welfare to set a lot size that in this case they said was larger than 3,000 square feet. And we think that's going to help Texas remain on the forefront of affordability and remain on the forefront of extraordinarily low homeless rates.
All right. Well, thank you, Ed. And I want to encourage those who are listening today, especially if you're involved as state legislators on the local level, reach out to Ed and his team over at AEI. They can really help you make some real improvements in your local zoning codes and really deliver on home affordability to your constituents. And with that, this webinar will conclude. I want to thank everyone for your support of advancing American freedom. It's our donors that make it possible to get these ideas in front of students, staffers, Congress people, and a wide reach in the media. If you want to learn more, please reply to the follow-up email that you receive after this webinar concludes. Thank you.